So the contents of the bill have been available for weeks. And so at this point, I'm not going to go further into the bill, but I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the fiscal year 2013 Department of Defense bill. I first want to thank Chairman Young for his very generous comments about my service on the Defense Subcommittee. And he is absolutely right. We have always, no matter who is chairman or which party was in control, we've always, on a bipartisan basis, worked to take care of the needs of our troops, to make sure that we were properly funded in equipment, and to do it on the basis of what was right and what was necessary. And I appreciate his leadership of this subcommittee, and I wish him well as we finish up this year. This bill continues the Defense Subcommittee's long tradition, as I mentioned, of bipartisanship and finding common ground as members work together under Mr. Young's leadership to provide for the Department of Defense. I'm pleased to report that the subcommittee has again crafted a bill that places national security and the needs of U.S. service members above partisan politics. I strongly support the priorities set in this bill. The bill supports our troops. It includes funding for the third consecutive year to replace inadequate schools owned by local educational authorities and the Department of Education that are located on military installations. It includes $40 million above the request for impact aid. It includes $125 million above the request for traumatic brain injury and psychological health, as well as an additional $20 million above the request for suicide prevention and outreach. And the bill has a total of $1.2 billion in defense health program research and development, $545 million above the request. The bill continues the committee's longstanding support for peer-reviewed breast cancer research, peer-reviewed prostate cancer research, vision research, spinal cord research, and many other medical research initiatives. The bill supports the Guard and Reserve. It includes funding to pause force structure reductions and aircraft retirements proposed by the Air Force that would affect Air Guard and Reserve units across the country. And the bill contains $2 billion for the National Guard and Reserve equipment account. The bill supports today's equipment needs and develops tomorrow's technology. It supports Secretary Panetta's strategic focus on the Asian-Pacific region by including robust funding for shipbuilding and the Patriot missile defense system. The bill supports DoD's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance needs by providing the resources for Global Hawk UAVs. The bill addresses the Navy strike fighter shortfall by funding F-18 Hornets and providing advanced procurement for F-18G electronic attack aircraft. The bill provides for ground equipment such as the Abrams tank, Bradley fighting vehicle, and Humvee modernization. This funding provides for Army equipment needs, including the Guard and Reserve, and helps maintain a stable industrial base. The bill includes $250 million for the Rapid Innovation Fund that will continue the committee's efforts started in 2011 to promote innovative research in defense technologies among small businesses. And the bill includes funding above the request for joint U.S.-Israeli missile defense activities, including $680 million for Iron Dome. The bill funds operations in Afghanistan consistent with the President's plan to wind down our presence as agreed to in the Lisbon Accord of 2010 and this year's NATO summit in Chicago. The bill also includes important restrictions on DoD activities. The bill prohibits permanent U.S. bases in Iraq or Afghanistan and prohibits U.S. control over Iraqi oil resources. The bill prohibits the torture of detainees. The bill prohibits training foreign military forces if these forces are known to commit gross violations of human rights. And the bill limits reimbursements to Pakistan until the Secretary of Defense, in consultation with the Secretary of State, certifies that Pakistan is working cooperatively with the U.S. against terrorist activity. While I support the funding level and priorities included in this bill, I must also express my objection not to Mr. Young, but to the majority decision to renege on the bipartisan agreement reached less than a year ago in the Budget Control Act. I believe the reduced discretionary allocation in the Ryan budget threatens to stall economic growth and job creation, and in the near term it introduces uncertainty in our appropriations process that imperils our ability to produce these bills in a timely manner. Accordingly, it is my belief that we could save a considerable amount of time in the appropriations process if we simply return to the agreement reached last year in August. The $1.047 trillion allocation level for this year, a level which even the Republican Senate other body leadership concedes is where we will eventually end up. Despite this reservation, I want to congratulate Chairman Young for producing a bill that meets the most pressing needs of the Department of Defense, and for doing so in the best tradition of the Appropriations Committee. And I must say that I feel we have one of the best staffs on the whole Hill. And I know Paul and Tom have worked together when Paul was the clerk, and Tom was representing Mr. Young as the ranking member. And the cooperation of all the staff members has been extraordinary, and they worked very hard to prepare this bill for the floor, and I want to congratulate them on their good efforts. And also I want to thank Mr. Rogers for his efforts to restore regular order. I think it's outstanding that we have had this bill in a subcommittee markup, full committee markup, now brought to the floor under an open rule. And this is the way this committee should operate, and I just appreciate his efforts to provide that leadership. And with that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Chair recognizes
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Young.
I yield 5 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Rogers.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of this essential bill. It provides more than $519 billion in critical resources for a strong national defense, supporting our warfighters and protecting the American people. This is an increase of $1.1 billion over last year, more than $3 billion more than what the President asked of us. It's also more than $8 billion over what the Senate Democrats would like to provide. This nation, with all the opportunities it provides and the rights it grants, would not be the bastion of freedom without the greatest defense system in the world. Freedom is not free. As we continue to face threats to our safety and way of life, we must deal with the costs of war, keep our military at the ready, and stay constantly vigilant. This bill supports and takes care of our troops at the highest level possible, providing a 1.7% pay raise. We've also increased the critical health and benefits program that our troops deserve, providing $35.1 billion for health and family programs, including funding for traumatic brain injury research and suicide prevention outreach programs. This legislation keeps America at the forefront of defense technologies by continuing research and development efforts. We boost key training and readiness programs to prepare our troops for combat and peacetime missions, with an increase of $12.1 billion for operations and maintenance. We also enhance our military arsenal with $102.5 billion for equipment and upgrades. And we continue fighting the global war on terror by including $88.5 billion for overseas contingency operations. But in this environment of fiscal austerity, the committee recognized that even the Pentagon should not have carte blanche when it comes to discretionary spending. We increased oversight and took a balanced approach to budgeting. Common sense decisions were made to save tax dollars wherever possible, including rescinding unused prior year funds and terminating unnecessary programs like the Medium Extended Air Defense System. But we can guarantee that none of these cuts will affect the safety or success of our troops and missions. The bill also prohibits funding for the transfers of Guantanamo detainees to the U.S. or its territories, prohibits funding to modify any facility in the U.S. to house detainees, and places strict conditions on the release of detainees, all provisions that were authorized under the National Defense Authorization. I want to take a moment, Mr. Chairman, to recognize the Appropriation Committee's ranking member, Mr. Dix, who also serves as ranking member of this Defense Subcommittee. He's been a formidable servant of the American people and a dedicated usher of appropriations dollars for some 36 years. And we appreciate his service. And as he moves to another phase of his life, we wish him well and Godspeed. He's been a great member of this committee and subcommittee and of this Congress. Also, I want to say a word of thanks to Jerry Lewis, California, who's been a member and chairman of the Defense Subcommittee and the full committee, for his many years of service to the appropriations process and to this Congress. We are sorry to lose the expertise, the leadership, the talent, friendship of these two gentlemen when they retire at the end of this year, but we wish them well in their next pursuits in life. The Appropriations Committee has been made stronger, more responsive, responsible, and respectful thanks to these two outstanding and upstanding legislators and appropriators. I also want to say a word of congratulations and thanks to our chairman, Bill Young, and to this great staff that Norm Dix has referred to as the greatest on the Hill, and I can't dispute that. They've worked long and hard on a very, very tough bill under austere circumstances to put together a bill that's necessary for our nation's defense. These many hours and capable hands that have had a touch on this bill, I think, have crafted a successful bipartisan bill that all of us can be proud to support. So congratulations, Chairman Young, for another great job. And you bring such expertise and experience to this chore that is so much appreciated by this body. Mr. Chairman, this is a must-pass piece of legislation, vital to the security of our homeland and the safety and health of our troops and veterans. I urge my colleagues to support this great nation and approve this necessary bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
So I want to yield 3 minutes to a very senior member of the Appropriations Committee, a member of the Defense Subcommittee, Congresswoman Kaptur from Ohio.
Lady from Ohio is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentleman from Washington for yielding me this time, and I want to acknowledge the work of our full committee under the chairmanship of Mr. Rogers, obviously the wonderful work of our chairman, Bill Young, and our subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Dix. Their collegial work has made this bill possible, and it will benefit our entire nation, our men and women in uniform, our armed forces, and all of those who are touched by this legislation. I would like to add my voice to those who wish to acknowledge the magnificent work that Congressman Dix has done during his years of service to our country, back from the time when he first worked for Senator Warren Magnuson. And we would like to wish him, his wife Susie, their beautiful family, many healthy and productive years ahead. We thank him for his distinguished and honorable and intrepid service, always dutiful, always enlightened, and when he walks from these halls officially, he takes great knowledge and should take great satisfaction with him for a job well done indeed. And I want to extend to Congressman Jerry Lewis as well deep appreciation from the people of our state and country for your incredible service. I would venture to say when both you gentlemen leave these chambers, nearly a century of knowledge will walk with you, and you have left America with her strongest defense globally and you have been a part of crafting every single line of these bills, and America thanks you and the world thanks you. This bill has been written in a bipartisan way by our subcommittee, and I thank the members for working collaboratively together. It is a model for our committee in Congress on how to do the work necessary to meet the needs of the American people. The bill includes $125 million above the President's request for funding health research for traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress disorder, the signature wounds of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our bill also includes an additional $246 million for cancer research, including breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian and lung cancer. The bill also includes funding for the Iron Dome. And during the last decade of war, our National Guard and Reserve units have proven themselves as the strategic reserve force for our nation. The Air Force, in submitting their FY13 budget, did not appear to appropriately appreciate the importance of the Guard and Reserve because they targeted those units for mission reductions and cancellations, and our subcommittee has fixed this oversight by providing the necessary funding to allow the Guard and Reserve to continue their missions, which they do extremely well, at considerably less cost than the Air Force does. Our bill also fixes a continuing issue from the executive branch and maintains our nation's industrial base by making sure we do not end the domestic production capability for tanks. For the first time since World War II, the bill averts a plan to shut down the production line for 2 years. Shutting the lines would have cost the American taxpayers more money than producing tanks over the same time and would dismantle the critical, fragile supplier network. The legislation also continues the military's commitment to lead our nation toward energy independence. The Pentagon, as the largest petroleum user in the world, must lead our nation toward energy independence, and no challenge could be more vital to our national security and economic security interests. High fuel costs are an enormous burden on America's families, and it is also a severe and wasteful burden on our service branches and diverts funds from important readiness and modernization needs. Thank you, Mr. Dix, for this time. Godspeed to you and your family in the years ahead. Thank you, Congressman Lewis, to you and to your wife, Arlene. Many wonderful years ahead. Thank you, Chairman Young, for being a chairman that brings this Congress together at the subcommittee level, and Chairman Rogers at the full committee level for working with all our members to meet the needs of our nation and our nation's defense. And I yield back my remaining time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I yield 4 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Frelinghuysen, who is an extremely important member of this subcommittee and also represents this subcommittee with the Intelligence Committee. Mr. Frelinghuysen, 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Florida for yielding and for his leadership, and that of Mr. Dix as well. In preparation for this debate, the subcommittee held a lengthy series of hearings examining such varied issues as our operations in Afghanistan, the so-called pivot to the Asia-Pacific region, Army modernization, Navy shipbuilding, Marine end strength, and the Air Force restructuring proposals. Most of these issues relate, as the Chairman has said, to mitigating risk in the defense budget and what's called the new strategic guidance from the Department of Defense, what I'd characterize as protecting our gains in the Middle East and elsewhere, as well as preparing for future and current threats. China's growing military capacity, instability in the Korean Peninsula, the civil war in Syria, Iran's pledge to close the Straits of Hormuz, and others. As you'll hear during this debate, the committee weighed in with its own options. As the Chairman says, we paused the Air Force restructuring decisions. In light of the tyranny of distance that characterized the Asia-Pacific region, we bolster the Navy's shipbuilding accounts and add back in a Virginia-class submarine and a Burt-class destroyer. Our goal here and throughout the bill was to provide the resources to support our warfighters now and in the future whenever the next crisis arises. Well, we clearly recognize that the nation's debt and deficit and found areas and programs where reductions were possible without adversely impacting our armed forces in modernization and readiness efforts. Exercising our mandate to adhere to a sound budgeting, we reclaimed funding for programs terminated or restructured, since the budget was released, achieved savings from favorable contract price adjustments, such as multi-year procurements of complicated weapon systems. We cut unjustified cost increases or funding requested ahead of need, and we took rescissions from surplus from prior year funds. Frankly, it's important that we find savings without harming readiness and or increasing the risk incurred by our warfighters. Mr. Chairman, the legislation before us includes funding for critical national security needs and provides the necessary resources to continue the nation's vital military efforts abroad. In addition, the bill provides essential funding for health and quality of life programs for our men and women in uniform, all volunteers and their families. I want to thank Chairman Young, Mr. Dix, the ranking member, Chairman Rogers, and all the members of the subcommittee for their work and the excellent staff we have, and our past leadership and our continued leadership from Congressman Jerry Lewis from California. We're all able to work together in a bipartisan manner to ensure that our men and women in uniform, all volunteers and their families, have the support they need. The years ahead will be challenging, but our defense bill will meet those needs, and I'm pleased to yield back the balance of my time.
Back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Washington.
I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey. He and I were in the same class together and have enjoyed many spirited debates on national security issues. And I consider him to be a good friend and someone who cares a great deal about these issues.
Gentleman is recognized.
And I thank the gentleman.
For 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. We started, Mr. Dixon and I, 36 years ago, at the height of the Cold War, with each country building more and more nuclear weapons, more and more defense systems, in an ever-escalating war of nerves that kept both countries and the whole world on edge. But in this Republican Fantasyland gold-plated nuclear weapons systems budget, there are going to be programs that have long outlived their usefulness that are lavished with canyons filled with cash. In this Fantasyland, the Cold War never ended. The Soviet menace lives on, making it necessary to maintain vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons and build new bombers to penetrate the Iron Curtain. In this Fantasyland, there are mountains of money for intercontinental ballistic missiles towering over the landscape and providing shade and comfort to the legions of defense contractors making nuclear weapons we no longer need and we can no longer afford. In this Fantasyland, the Republicans want to retroactively refight the Cold War that we won. This makes no sense. Mr. Speaker, it is time to get real. Sequestration is coming. The Republicans in their budget are ignoring the doomsday clock that has nearly reached midnight for millions of hard-working Americans. We must prepare for this reality. The bill the Republicans have brought to the floor today provides the Pentagon with $1 billion more than this year's spending level and $3 billion more than the Obama administration requested. Despite sequestration, despite budget pressures, despite the fragility of the economy, the Republicans still want to increase defense spending. And why? Well, to pay for more radioactive relics of the past that no longer are needed in order to protect our country. But I have good news for my friends on the other side of the aisle. The Cold War ended more than 20 years ago. The Soviet Union crumbled. It's okay to stop funding nuclear weapons to perpetuate a Cold War rivalry that has disappeared into the mists of history. We don't have to buy into this insanity. That is why I plan to offer several sane amendments to reduce Pentagon spending on unnecessary, outdated nuclear weapons programs. Now, here's the bottom line. Beginning in January 1st of next year, 5 months from now, $55 billion has to be cut out of the defense budget, and $55 billion has to be cut out of civilian programs, social programs, 55 and 55 billion apiece. The Republicans are increasing defense spending heading into that. Moreover, they're saying, don't cut defense at all, cut the social programs. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means cutting the NIH, cutting CDC, cutting the National Cancer Institute. They're already going to be cut under sequestration. What the Republicans are proposing is to really create a true doomsday machine. And that doomsday machine is the lack of a cure for Alzheimer's, for Parkinson's, for all of the other diseases which actually do pose a terrorist threat to families across the country when they get the call that once more that disease has come through their family because we, that is the Republicans, have decided that they're going to continue to cut the research for the cure for disease and instead build more nuclear weapons to be aimed at targets that no longer exist. And so this is an important debate to have. It's a sequestration anticipation debate where we begin to be forced to get real. We have to have a debate about what the priorities in the 21st century are going to be, and not some Dr. Strangelove smiling from his grave being so happy that we're still debating additional nuclear weapons
Gentleman's time
being
has
constructed in our
expired.
country.
Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman
And I
from
want to
Florida.
say to the House that we understand the importance of sequestration, and we have got to stop sequestration. It is just not good, especially for our national defense. But this Congress, this committee has not ignored the issue. Last year alone, this committee recommended a bill that reduced fiscal year 12, fiscal year 13, a total of $39 billion. But we did it carefully. We did it by not just going across the board, cutting muscle out of our national defense. We took money that wasn't going to be spent anyway. So we understand the importance of meeting the deadlines on funding reductions. We don't want sequestration. It is not good for the military. It is not good for the country. It is not good for the economy. And now I would like to yield 3 minutes to Mr. Crenshaw, who is one of our subcommittee chairmen on appropriations.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for yielding. And I rise in strong support of this legislation. Let me first say thank you to the Chairman, Chairman Young, Congressman Dix, the ranking member. Thank you not only for your leadership in bringing this bill to the floor, but thank you for your spirit of cooperation, your spirit of bipartisanship, which has pervaded our subcommittee. And as we bring this before the full House, I think there is great agreement among those that serve on the subcommittee. When you stop and think about the fact that national security is probably the #1 responsibility of the federal government, the only way to keep America safe is to keep America strong, and I think this bill does that. Now, you'll hear people say, you just heard people say, why do we need to spend so much money on defense? The Cold War is over. We're pulling out of Afghanistan. We're no longer going to be in Iraq. Why don't we just kind of pay a peace dividend? Well, as Congressman Chairman Young just pointed out, we're in the midst of a program where we are reducing spending on national defense. We looked at every agency of federal government and said, you've got to do more with less. You've got to tighten your belt. And the Defense Department is no different. And we're in the middle of actually reducing spending $487 billion over the next 10 years. And then, of course, we face this draconian cut of sequestration. But I think that we got to keep in mind that it is the #1 responsibility. We asking our troops, asking our military to do things. We certainly have the best trained and the best equipped military in the history of this world. But you look at our Navy, for instance, we have half as many ships as we had 30 years ago. Half as many, and yet we're asking them to do so many things. Sure, the ships are more technologically advanced. Sure, we've got better trained people, but stop and think about it. When you ask the Navy to go out and interdict drug runners in the Caribbean, and you say, chase the pirates off the coast of Somalia, and send a carrier into the Mediterranean, guard the Straits of Hormuz when Iran rattles its saber, conduct humanitarian missions down in Haiti, and by the way, keep an eye on the Pacific Rim because that's where China is flexing its muscle. Remember, numbers matter. The world is no smaller. We still haven't solved the problem of how do you have one ship in two places at the same time. And so it's important that we continue to provide the resources that we need to have a strong national defense. I think this bill does that. I think we should all support this, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
I reserve my time. We have no further speakers. If the gentleman from Florida wants to go ahead with his
time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, a very important member of this subcommittee.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. That's very generous. I'm the most junior member of this subcommittee. But I'd be remiss not to echo the praise of my colleagues, both for the chairman and the ranking member. They have worked together extraordinarily well in a way that makes us all proud. And frankly, Mr. Dix, I'm going to miss you greatly from this committee. You've been a mentor and a friend, and thank goodness Mr. Young will still be here, and I'll have somebody's knee to learn at. This is a good bill. It does, as been mentioned earlier, add roughly $1 billion from roughly $519 billion in the base defense bill. What hasn't been mentioned, though, is that our overseas contingency fund, $88.5 billion, is actually down $27 billion. So we're actually spending less overall on defense this year. We'll reduce the number of personnel by over 21,000. And we ought to recognize, for those of our friends who think we're spending too much, we're actually at the beginning of a long drawdown. If you look over the next 5 years, sadly, we're going to reduce defense spending by $500 billion. That means less capability. That means 70,000 fewer soldiers, 20,000 fewer Marines. That means 25 fewer combat vessels, 288 instead of 313, 7 fewer aircraft fighter wings, real reduction in capability. A lot of our friends think we spend too much on defense. The reality is we spend less and less as a percentage of our federal budget and our overall wealth every year. In the 1970s, we were spending 40% plus of the federal budget. This year, it's less than 20. We were spending 9% of GDP at the height of the Cold War. This year, barely 4%. For those of us that think this investment hasn't made a difference, I would just recommend in closing, please read Robert Kagan's splendid book, The World America Has Made, and think how much freedom and security we've enjoyed for a relatively small price, and think about the risk we've run as we go forward if we reduce too far too fast. I want to thank again the chairman, the ranking member, for making sure that didn't happen. I look forward to working with him to make sure sequestration does not occur. As he rightly points out, it would be devastating. But we should pass this bill, and then we should get about the longer-term challenge of making sure sequestration does not occur. Without a yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry.
Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank the gentleman from Florida for the time and for your leadership on this critically important bill. Mr. Speaker, in the push and pull and give and take of the congressional appropriations process, we have had many important debates on the proper role of the federal government in society. But despite our differences and competing priorities, it is clear that Americans believe in a federal government that provides a strong common defense as a priority. American military leadership is important for our own security, but also for global stability and global human rights. It is also important for my home state of Nebraska. Over the past 10 years, Mr. Speaker, 15,000 Nebraskans in uniform have served overseas. Today, 17,000 men and women stationed in Nebraska work tirelessly to strengthen our national security. American troops are steadfast, selfless, and undeterred in their service and deserve our unwavering support. This bill, I believe, reflects responsibly the challenges of our times. Further amendments may actually strengthen the bill creatively in balance with our fiscal obligations, but moving forward with our primary obligation to govern in defense of our nation should be our guiding principle here. Let me add, Mr. Speaker, that I learned in this debate that this is Mr. Dix's retiring session, and I also want to add my thanks for your many years of good service. Mr. Young, I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to inquire of the gentleman if he has further speakers on the general debate.
I have no further speakers. Is the chairman going to close, or?
Yes.
I yield back the balance of my
Gentleman
time.
yields back. Chair recognizes gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of the time. And before I yield back, I want to take a minute to thank the staff who have worked tirelessly on this bill. Mr. Dix mentioned them earlier on. We have the responsibility to appropriate for the authorization of the Intelligence Committee and for the authorization legislation of the Armed Services Committee. You can imagine that that is quite a responsibility. The staffing is extremely important because our staff is limited in size to the combined numbers of staff on those two committees that we do appropriate for. But I want to call special attention to, for example, the minority staff who work directly with Mr. Dix, Paul Jola and Becky Legere. Paul Jola actually worked in that capacity for the majority staff when we were the majority. In fact, when I was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I hired Paul. So you can see this is a very non-political subcommittee. Brooke Boyer on the majority staff, Walter Hearn, Tom McLemore, who is the chief clerk of the majority staff, Jennifer Miller, Tim Prince, Adrian Ramsey, Ann Reese, Megan Rosenbush, Paul Terry, B.G. Wright, and Sherry Young. And they are quite a team. And they are able to analyze the budget requests, the budget justifications, and keep the membership advised. So I want to thank them very much for the good work that they do. Mr. Chairman, we're prepared to yield back our time and move on to the 5-minute rule for amendments. So I do yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair may accord priority in recognition to a member offering an amendment who has caused it to be printed in the designated place in the congressional record. Those amendments will be considered read. The clerk will read.
Be it enacted the following sums are appropriated for fiscal year 2013, namely, Title I, Military Personnel, $40,730,014,000.
Gentlelady from Minnesota seeks recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
In the record as well, Mr. Chairman.
Amendment number 4, printed in the congressional record, offered by Ms. McCollum of Minnesota.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I do my prepared remarks, I would very much also like to thank both Chairman Rogers and Chairman Young for the courtesies and all the help that they and their staffs have given me since their being on the Appropriation Committee in the positions that they are. But Mr. Dix, I would especially like to thank you for being a mentor and a guide star through this, not only on the Defense Appropriations Bill, but in the Interior Bill, and just in general to working on health care. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Over the past 4 years, the Department of Defense has spent a stunning $1.55 billion on military bands, musical performances, and concert tours around the world. That's right. $1.55 billion in taxpayer funds for 4 years for military bands. This amendment reduces the Pentagon spending for military bands and musical performances from the $388 million in this bill to $2 million for fiscal year 2013. The $188 million reduction is a transfer to the deficit reduction account. In the National Defense Authorization Act, H.R. 4310, the House included language to limit the authorization for military musical units not to exceed $200 million. This amendment conforms with the defense authorization while cutting spending by $188 million. Our nation is in a fiscal crisis. The Pentagon is on pace to spend $4 billion over the next decade on military bands. Is the United States really going to borrow money from China and other foreign countries so the Defense Department can spend billions of dollars for its 140 bands and more than 5,000 full-time professional musicians? How does this enhance our national security? Congress has a duty to provide the necessary resources for our armed forces and to ensure our national defense. We also have an obligation to ensure that every dollar in this bill is strengthening our national security. Spending $388 million of taxpayers' money on military music does not make our nation more secure. It is a luxury, and the Pentagon and the taxpayers could just no longer afford it. Before he retired last year, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates said, and I quote, "We must come to the realization that not every defense program is necessary, not every defense dollar is sacred and well spent, and that more of everything is simply not sustainable." Mr. Chairman, the defense dollars I want to cut from military musical units is not necessary, it is not sacred, and it is not well spent with so many other pressing needs. In this fiscal environment, it is simply not sustainable. I don't think anyone here today will tell the American people that there is no waste or excess in the Pentagon's budget. This Congress should be protecting waste and excess in the Pentagon. It should not protect it, it should cut it. There's a lot of talk, mostly from my Republican colleagues, about protecting the defense budget from the sequester and protecting millionaires and billionaires from expiring tax cuts. Protecting every single defense dollar means shifting the burden and the pain for millions of additional budget cuts to local communities, to middle-class families, seniors, the poor, and the vulnerable children. In this, Mr. Chairman, I was going to ask for order, but it's resolved itself.
Excuse me.
Is this Congress going to really kick more kids off a school lunch program and make deeper cuts to our first responders in order to justify paying for more military music? Well, that will not be my choice. That does not reflect my values, and is not the legacy I want to leave behind as a policymaker. This amendment cuts the program that has grown out of control. It reduces the deficit, and it does nothing to impact military readiness, mission strength, or our troops' ability to defend our nation. I urge my colleagues to support the McCollum Amendment, and I urge my colleagues to cut unnecessary funding for military bands. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'm reluctant to do that because I have the privilege of working with Ms. McCollum on another subcommittee and on the full committee, and she's always very sincere and very generous in the way she treats the issues that she's working with. But I just don't think that we want to eliminate military bands. First, I must tell you that those who play in the band are trained as basic combat troops, and they are called upon in a time of emergency. They are called upon to provide security for a military headquarters, wherever it may be located. So I don't think that we want to do away with that capability. Now, 91% of the money that goes to these military bands is for pay, to pay the members and their basic pay, their allowances, their uniforms, their foods, and I just don't think that we want to do that. Now, our military bands play for the President, play for military functions, but many communities in our country are constantly inviting military bands to come play patriotic programs in our hometowns. And this is good for our community. This lets us be part of our military. This doesn't put our military in a barrack someplace and keep them isolated from the general population. And I think the military should be part of our general population. I just believe that this is not a good idea. 91% of this money will come out of the military personnel account, which pays for very important things like salaries, military expenses of feeding, of caring for our military personnel. And why should we put our military isolated from the community? They should be part of our community. It's an all-volunteer force. And this country needs a good shot of patriotism because we've had too much negativism coming at us from all different directions. This is a positive country. This is a patriotic country. Excuse me. And we ought to allow our military to show off their talents, and not only on the battlefield where they risk their lives, lose their lives, or are terribly injured. So I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Minnesota. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed. Gentlelady from Minnesota.
I request a recorded vote.
Request for a reported vote pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Minnesota will be postponed.
Revise or extend for 5 minutes.
Gentleman from California moves to strike the last word. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the 2013 Defense Appropriation Bill. First, I want to thank my chairman and friend, Chairman Young, and my friend, the ranking member, Dix, for their hard work, and their staff, both the majority and the minority, for extremely thoughtful and balanced bill. In crafting this bill, the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee held countless hearings, ensured that strong congressional oversight was alive and well. And it's been an honor to serve on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and I can attest to the hard work that's gone into this bill. Our nation's first priority is the protection of our citizens and our national interests around the world. This bill fulfills that duty. The FY13 Defense Appropriation Bill also fulfills a promise to our U.S. service members that they will continue to receive the best training, equipment, and health care. Likewise, the bill fulfills the needed requirements to ensure that our commanders have the tools they need to accomplish U.S. missions around the world and support America's defense and our industrial base. I understand that many members may have objections to the overall funding level of the defense bill, and there's no doubt that every aspect of government, including defense, must come under close fiscal scrutiny. However, the short-term benefits of decimating defense will only leave us more economically precarious in the future. This bill properly balances the need to make responsible cuts while ensuring that America maintains its military superiority. And on a personal basis, I want to thank some friends that are leaving the committee, Jerry Lewis and Norm Dix, for their many years of service. Not only are they colleagues, but they're good friends, and we're going to miss their service here in this institution. So I thank you for all your hard work. And lastly, I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. What person, gentleman? Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman moves to strike the last word. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this year marks the 12th consecutive appropriation season that the United States has been fighting and funding the war in Afghanistan. Sometimes it's easy to forget that we are still deep in war in Afghanistan. The threat of nuclear weapons in Iran, drone strikes in Pakistan, the nightmare of mass murder in Syria garner the attention of the news media. But but we currently have more than 90,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan and about 110,000 contractors. Some of these troops are slated to come home over this summer, but many more, approximately 88,000, will remain. And the exact number of troops that will remain in Afghanistan as the U.S. and allies transition to local security forces through 2013 and 2014 is still unclear. Neither the Pentagon nor the administration has publicly laid out post-2014 plans, but they are clearly leaving open the possibility of a significant military presence. This is the reality we face as we open debate on this bill. Mr. Chairman, I am not convinced that there is any light at the end of the tunnel. I am not convinced that this war is coming to an end, and I do not believe we should continue sacrificing the dedication and blood of our servicemen and women for a deeply flawed and corrupt government that is simply not fixable. Oh, we can change the names and the programs and the projects, but it's simply more of the same problems over and over and over again. It is regrettable that this war is not more of a priority in public debate, and it is unconscionable that debating this war is not a top priority for this Congress. The majority wouldn't even let us have a full debate and vote on an amendment during the Defense Authorizations Bill to make sure that the commitments made by the administration to draw down our troops over the next 2 years are kept. Congress is deeply complicit in maintaining and continuing this war. We've allocated $634 billion for military operations in Afghanistan since 2001, including the $85.6 billion in this bill. We're not just spending those billions, Mr. Chairman, we're borrowing them. Every single penny for the war in Afghanistan has been borrowed, put on the national credit card, exploded our deficit and our debt, every single penny. Each week of the war in 2012 cost about $2 billion. If the Pentagon's enduring presence means thousands of troops remaining in Afghanistan after 2014 for who knows how long, then we are looking at a $1 trillion war. Meanwhile, we're cutting funds for our schools, preparing to slash billions of dollars from the safety net that's supposed to keep our people out of poverty. We're watching our roads and our bridges crumble, water systems and infrastructure decay, and we're told there's no money to invest in health care and scientific research. And for what, Mr. Chairman? For what? Show me where our military might has put a permanent end to instability, violence, and corruption. Even though the media isn't focused on it, the violence in Afghanistan goes on. The U.S. death toll for Operation Enduring Freedom is over 2,000. 1,919 of those deaths happened in Afghanistan. Members of the Afghan military and security forces continue to turn their guns on our troops and murder them. According to the Pentagon, 154 active-duty soldiers committed suicide in the first 159 days of this year. That's almost one per day. And as for our veterans, the VA estimates that a veteran dies by suicide every 80 minutes. How long will we ask our troops and their families to pay this price? Because they're the only ones paying for this war, Mr. Chairman, the only ones. And I don't believe we should abandon the people of Afghanistan, but I do believe we must end this war sooner rather than later. And I'm not convinced we're anywhere close to an end. And it's the fault of Congress. We approve the money and we remain silent year after year after year. We need to stop. We aren't supporting our troops. We're committing them to suffer lifelong trauma from too many deployments, for too long a time, over too many years. For a war without end, for a war that always needs just a little more time and just a few $1 billion more. Enough is enough. I urge my colleagues to support amendments over the next 3 days to reduce the funding for this war, bring it to an end, and honor the sacrifice of our troops by bringing them and our tax dollars back home. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd rise to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I join my friend from Massachusetts and anyone else, Republican or Democrat, to say it's time to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. I want to thank Chairman Young, Ranking Member Dix for an excellent bill. I agree with probably 80% of it. But I cannot continue to support legislation that sends billions and billions and billions of dollars to Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, I have a book here in my hand called Funding the Enemy.
how U.S. taxpayers bankroll the Taliban. And one of the critiques I would like to read on the back of this book is from the State Department Foreign Service officer named Peter Van Buren, and I quote, "Sober, sad, and important. Funding the enemy peels back the layers of American engagement in Afghanistan to reveal its rotten core, and that the United States dollar meant for the country's future instead funds the insurgents and supports the Taliban, pay for both sides of the war, ensures America's ultimate defeat." Mr. Speaker, the reason I'm here today is because I have Camp Lejeune Marine Base in my district. I have signed over 10,474 letters to families who've lost loved ones since we were lied to go into Iraq. And while we will continue to support Karzai, I saw where Vice President Cheney was on the Hill yesterday. I've seen my colleagues today talking about sequestration, but I didn't see Mr. Karzai here. No, why should he not? Why should he be here? He's got his money in this bill. He doesn't have to worry about sequestration. All he's got to do is take care of his corrupt government in Afghanistan. It is time, Mr. Speaker, it is time that the Congress listen to 72% of the American people who say, bring our troops home now, not later. And I join my friend from Massachusetts in my concern about cutting programs for children who need milk in the morning, senior citizens who need sandwiches in the afternoon. We're going to cut their money, but we're going to still continue to support the Taliban who are killing American kids in Afghanistan because we have no accountability of where this $88 billion is going. It is time for this Congress to come together and say, yes, we will support our military, but we will not support a corrupt government who is not going to survive anyway. The enemy, the Taliban, will take over Afghanistan when it's all said and done. Please, America, bring pressure on the Congress to bring our troops home from Afghanistan, and I yield back the balance of my time. God help our men and women in uniform. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady moves to strike the last word. Gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we'll be spending the next several days debating the Department of Defense budget, a whopping $519.2 billion. By anyone's account, that's a lot of money. What we won't be debating is the future of our presence in Afghanistan. You'd think a Congress obsessed with the deficit and cutbacks would take a look at the costliest item on our books, the war in Afghanistan. Nope, no debate on that. Instead, a few of us coming here to the well to take a handful of 5-minute slots. This is for a war that has cost our nation in blood and treasure in ways we may never be able to add up. And what are those costs? As of today, we've spent $548 billion on the war. That's $10 billion a month. Actually, it's more than this year's DoD budget. This year, we face the 2,000th death in Operation Enduring Freedom. More than 15,000 of our brave men and women in uniform have returned home wounded. Every day, we lose one more service member to suicide. And the Afghan people, how many of them have died and been wounded? So the other side of the aisle wants to talk about cost. Well, let's do that. What has this misguided war cost us in international standing? Is the U.S. more popular in the Middle East and Central Asia? No. Are we any safer? Probably not. As a new generation of Afghan children grow up in an occupied country, aren't they learning to hate the West? Yes. And what's the cost here at home? How many cops could we have put on the beat? How many homes could have been saved from foreclosure? How many farmers could get drought relief? How many small business jobs could have been created? How many more patients could we have cared for at our veterans' hospitals? We'll never know. Because instead of having an honest and open debate about our spending priorities, we have to grab 5 minutes here and 5 minutes there. That's not what the American people want. They want transparency. They want more debate. Further than that, they want this war to be over. They want our troops to come home. So yes, by all means, let's talk about costs. But let's not squeeze it in among $500 billion worth of weapons, planes, and the rest of the military-industrial complex. I urge the House leadership to have a real debate on the war in Afghanistan, and let's shine some light on how much it costs. I yield back.
Lady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Chair recognizes gentleman from Texas. For what purpose?
I move